Hi, I'm Rebecca. My dad cornered me in his hospital room saying, "You'll donate your liver to save my life, or you're no daughter of mine." But when I opened the DNA results and said, "I'm not your daughter, I'm your boss's," the entire room went silent. They called me heartless for refusing, but none of them asked why I hesitated. Not one of them knew that for 24 years I'd been living a lie so deep it rewrote my entire identity. And when I put the evidence on the table, my own father tried to destroy it right in front of me. But before I tell you what I did next, let me know in the comments what time you're watching and where you're from, because this isn't just a story about family obligations. It's about discovering your true identity when everyone around you has been living a scripted performance for decades. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was hunched over my laptop in my cramped studio apartment, finishing a grant proposal for the nonprofit where I worked. The fluorescent desk lamp cast harsh shadows across financial projections that blurred together after 8 straight hours of number crunching. My phone buzzed against the wooden surface, vibrating with an urgency that made my stomach clench before I even looked at the screen. "Dad?" "Mobile," flashed across the display. Colonel Marcus Webb never called this late unless something was catastrophically wrong. In 24 years, I could count on one hand the times he'd reached out after 9 p.m., and each instance had involved either a deployment notification or a family emergency that required immediate military-style coordination. I let it ring, twice before answering, my voice coming out rougher than intended. "Hello?" His voice sounded strained, like he was speaking through gritted teeth. "Rebecca, I need you at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Room 314, now." The background noise told me everything: the steady beeping of monitors, hushed conversations of medical staff, the antiseptic echo that only hospital corridors could produce. My chest tightened with a familiar dread that had followed me through every military family crisis since childhood. "What happened?" I asked, already reaching for my car keys. "Liver failure, acute. The doctors say I have maybe weeks, not months." His voice cracked slightly, a sound I'd never heard from the man who'd taught me that emotions were tactical weaknesses. "They're putting me on the transplant list, but at my age with my service record, let's just say the odds aren't favorable." Pulled on my jacket with one hand while balancing the phone with my shoulder. "I'm coming now. Have you called Mom?" A pause stretched between us, filled with the mechanical sounds of life support. "Your mother's already here. She's been here since yesterday." Yesterday. He'd been in the hospital since yesterday and nobody had told me. The familiar sting of being the last to know settled in my chest like an old wound reopening. Even in a medical crisis, I remained an afterthought in the Webb family communication chain. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, I said, grabbing my purse and heading for the door. "Rebecca." His voice stopped me mid-stride. "We need to discuss options. Medical options. The kind that require family participation." The way he said family participation made my skin crawl. There was something calculated about his tone, like he was setting up a chess move rather than asking for help. After 2 decades of living with Colonel Marcus Webb, I'd learned to recognize when he was maneuvering people into position. "We'll talk when I get there," I replied, ending the call before he could elaborate. The drive to Bethesda felt like navigating through thick fog, even though the interstate was clear. My mind kept cycling through worst-case scenarios while my hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Liver failure wasn't something that happened overnight. How long had he been sick? How long had they known? How long had... They discussed medical options without including me in the conversation? The parking garage at Bethesda Naval Hospital smelled like motor oil and disinfectant. I found a spot on the 3rd level and walked through the maze of concrete pillars toward the elevator bank, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The hospital operated on military time and military efficiency, but at midnight, even the most disciplined institution felt hollow and slightly menacing. Room 314 was in the hepatology wing, surrounded by the quiet tension that accompanies serious illness. I knocked once before pushing open the heavy door, unsure what I'd find inside. The sight hit me like a physical blow. Colonel Marcus Webb, the man who'd stood at rigid attention during every family photo, was connected to a constellation of tubes and wires. His skin had taken on a yellowish tint that spoke of organ failure, and his eyes, usually sharp with military precision, looked cloudy and unfocused. My mother, Patricia, sat in the bedside chair wearing the same expression she'd worn during every family crisis, controlled panic masked by artificial composure. She looked up when I entered, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rebecca, thank goodness you're here," she said, rising to give me a brief, uncomfortable hug. Even in a hospital room, she maintained the posture of a colonel's wife, back straight, emotions contained, ready to present a united front to any outside observers. Dad's eyes focused on me with visible effort. "Sit down. We need to talk about the transplant situation." I remained standing, suddenly hyper-aware of the power dynamic in the room. "What exactly is the situation?" Patricia answered before Dad could speak. "The waiting list for liver transplants is complicated. Your father's age and medical history put him at a disadvantage for receiving a cadaveric donation. The doctors suggested exploring living donor options. Living donor liver transplant." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I'd heard about the procedure. Surgeons could remove a portion of a healthy liver from a living donor, and both the donor's remaining liver and the transplanted portion would regenerate over time. It was major surgery with significant risks, but it offered hope when traditional transplant waiting lists provided only uncertainty. "Have you been tested for compatibility?" I asked, looking at Mom. She shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not a candidate due to my own health issues. High blood pressure, previous surgeries. The doctors ruled me out immediately." That left me the only other immediate family member. The obvious candidate sitting in the room like a spare part waiting to be harvested. Dad's voice cut through my thoughts with military directness. "Rebecca, you're young, healthy, and according to preliminary blood work from your last physical, you're likely compatible. The doctors can run more comprehensive tests, but the signs are positive." I stared at him, processing the implications. They'd already discussed this. They'd already consulted doctors. They'd already planned out how to approach me with this request. The whole conversation felt choreographed, like a briefing session where the outcome had been predetermined. "When were you planning to mention that you'd been researching my medical compatibility?" I asked. Patricia's face flushed slightly. "We wanted to gather all the facts before having this conversation. There was no point in worrying you unnecessarily." Worrying me unnecessarily. As if the decision to donate part of my liver to save my father's life was a minor inconvenience that required careful timing and strategic presentation. Dad leaned forward, his voice taking on the commanding tone I remembered from childhood. "Rebecca, this is family. Family doesn't abandon each other when things get difficult. I've given my entire life to service, to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Now I need protection, and you're the only one who can provide it." The guilt hit exactly where he'd aimed it. 24 years of being raised by a military hero, of being told that duty and sacrifice were the highest virtues, of learning that personal comfort always came second to family obligations. He wasn't just asking for my liver, he was activating every conditioning mechanism he'd installed in my psyche since childhood. "I need time to think about this," I said quietly. His expression hardened. "Time? Rebecca, we're talking about weeks here, maybe less. This isn't a decision you can research and analyze like one of your grant proposals. Sometimes life requires immediate action." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were contracting around me. Mom sat in her chair, watching the exchange, with the careful neutrality of someone who'd already chosen sides. Dad stared at me with an intensity that felt both desperate and demanding. "I understand the urgency," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But donating part of my liver isn't exactly a minor commitment. I need to understand the risks, the recovery time, the long-term implications. The risks are minimal for someone your age, Dad shot back. The doctors explained everything. 6 weeks recovery, maybe 8. You'll be back to normal by Christmas. Back to normal. As if major abdominal surgery was a temporary inconvenience, like getting a tooth filled, or updating my driver's license. As if carving out part of my organ to save his life was just another item on a to-do list. I looked around the room, at the man who'd raised me lying connected to machines, at my mother sitting with her hands folded in practiced resignation, at the medical charts hanging from the foot of the bed documenting organ failure in precise clinical language. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's family drama unfold from behind bulletproof glass. I'll talk to the doctors. Myself? I said finally. I'll get the information firsthand and make an informed decision. Dad's jaw tightened. There's nothing to decide, Rebecca. Family takes care of family. That's not a suggestion. It's an obligation. The word obligation hit me like a slap, not a request for help, not an appeal to love or compassion. An obligation. A duty that I was expected to fulfill without question, like saluting a superior officer or standing for the national anthem. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. I'll come back tomorrow after I've spoken with the medical team. Rebecca, Mom called as I headed toward the door. I paused but didn't turn around. Your father has given everything for this family, she said quietly. For his country. For people he's never even met. Now he needs something from us. I turned the door handle and stepped into the hallway without responding. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter outside his room, almost blinding after the dim hospital lighting. I walked quickly toward the elevator, my heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. In the elevator, alone finally, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The metallic taste of anxiety filled my mouth, and my hands trembled slightly as I pressed the button for the parking garage. Something about the entire interaction felt wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what. Maybe it was the way they'd planned the conversation without me. Maybe it was the assumption that I'd agree without hesitation. Maybe it was the clinical way they'd discussed carving up my body to save his life, like we were discussing spare parts rather than major surgery. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I'd never been able to articulate about my relationship with Colonel Marcus Webb. For 24 years, I'd felt like I was performing the role of his daughter rather than actually being his daughter. Like there was a script I was supposed to follow, but nobody had ever given me a copy. Standing in that hospital room, listening to him demand my liver as family obligation, I felt that old familiar distance creeping back in, the sense that I was watching the Webb family from the outside, even though I was supposedly part of it. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I walked through the parking garage toward my car. The night air was cool against my skin, a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the hospital room. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the concrete wall in front of me while my mind processed everything that had just happened. Tomorrow, I would talk to doctors. Tomorrow, I would gather medical information. Tomorrow, I would try to make sense of why a simple request for help felt like stepping into quicksand. But tonight, driving home through empty streets, all I could think about was the way Dad had looked at me when he said family obligation. Not like a father asking his daughter for help. Like a commanding officer expecting a subordinate to follow orders without question. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering what would happen if I said no. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that felt more like a coordinated military campaign than family concern. It started at 7:15 a.m. with my Aunt Linda, Dad's sister, calling from her home in Virginia Beach. "Rebecca, honey, I heard about your father's condition," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone military families use when discussing serious matters. Controlled urgency wrapped in artificial calm. Patricia told me you're going to be tested as a donor. That's so brave of you. I hadn't even had coffee yet, and already the family network was buzzing with information I hadn't agreed to share. I'm still gathering information about the procedure, I replied carefully. Oh well, of course you need to understand everything, Linda continued, but her tone suggested this was merely a formality. But Marcus has always been there for everyone. In this family, remember when your cousin Jake needed bail money for that DUI? Marcus didn't hesitate. And when Uncle Robert lost his job, who do you think paid for his kids' school clothes? The guilt trip had begun in earnest. Linda wasn't calling to check on my well-being or offer emotional support. She was calling to remind me of family debts and obligations, to ensure I understood that refusing would violate some unspoken military family code. By 9 a.m., my phone had buzzed with texts from 3 more relatives, each one expressing their support for my decision to help Dad. Cousin Maria, so proud of you for stepping up. Uncle Pete, your dad's lucky to have such a dedicated daughter. Grandmother Webb, family sacrifices for family. Always has, always will. The presumption infuriated me. Somewhere between leaving the hospital last night and this morning's propaganda campaign, my reluctance to immediately volunteer my organs had been transformed into confirmed participation. They were discussing my liver donation like it was already scheduled, as if my actual consent was an administrative detail to be handled later. I called the hospital's transplant coordinator directly, bypassing any family intermediaries. Dr. Sarah Martinez had a reassuring voice and 20 years of experience guiding families through these decisions. I'd like to understand the living donor evaluation process, I told her. My father is Marcus Webb, currently in hepatology. Yes, I've been expecting your call, Dr. Martinez replied. Your mother mentioned you'd be reaching out. The evaluation process is quite comprehensive. Medical testing, psychological assessment, social work consultation. We want to ensure donors are making informed, voluntary decisions. The word voluntary struck me as significant. How often do potential donors change their minds during evaluation? More often than you might think, she said gently. Living donation is a major decision that affects the donor's life permanently. Some people realize they're not emotionally prepared, others discover medical complications, and some simply decide the risks outweigh their willingness to help. All of those reasons are completely valid. I scheduled an appointment for the following week, giving myself time to research everything independently. But the family pressure campaign intensified throughout the day. Patricia called during my lunch break. Rebecca, I've been thinking about the timing. If we can get your evaluation started immediately, we might be able to schedule surgery within the month. The doctors say Dad's condition could deteriorate rapidly. Mom, I haven't even decided if I'm going through with this, I said. A pause. What do you mean? I mean, I'm still evaluating whether liver donation is something I'm willing and able to do. Her voice took on that particular edge I remembered from childhood, disappointment mixed with disbelief. Rebecca, this is your father we're talking about. The man who raised you, who put you through college, who's always been there when you needed him. Always been there. The phrase echoed strangely in my mind. Had he always been there? My memories of childhood felt oddly fragmented when I tried to focus on specific moments of paternal connection. There had been discipline, structure, expectations, but warmth? Affection? The kind of unconditional love that would make sacrificing part of my liver feel like an obvious choice? I need time to think, Mom. Think about what exactly? This isn't a philosophical debate, Rebecca. Your father is dying. That evening, I drove to my friend Casey's apartment in Georgetown. Casey had been my roommate during graduate school and remained one of the few people who knew me outside the military family context. She made dinner while I explained the situation. her expression growing increasingly concerned as I described the coordinated family pressure. "Wait," she said, pausing while chopping vegetables. "They're all calling you like the decision has already been made?" "Basically. And they're acting like refusing would make me some kind of heartless monster." Casey set down her knife and looked at me directly. "Rebecca, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "In all the years I've known you, you've never really talked about your relationship with your dad. Like, your mom? Yes, you complain about her interference and her expectations. But your dad, it's like he's this distant figure you respect, but don't really connect with." Her observation hit something deep and uncomfortable. She was right. I talked about Dad the way people discuss historical figures, with respect for his accomplishments and service, but without the warmth or intimacy that usually characterizes parent-child relationships. "Do you love him?" Casey asked gently. The question should have been easy to answer. Of course I loved my father. He was my father. But sitting in Casey's kitchen, trying to formulate a response, I realized I didn't actually know what loving Marcus Webb felt like. "I respect him," I said finally. "I'm grateful for the opportunities he provided. I admire his service record." That's not what I asked. I stared at my hands. I don't know if I love him the way daughters are supposed to love their fathers. And I don't know if that makes me a terrible person, or if there's something wrong with our relationship. Casey sat down across from me. "Have you ever felt like you really belonged in your family?" The question opened a floodgate I'd kept carefully, sealed for years. No, I'd never felt like I belonged. I'd felt like an outsider performing the role of daughter, following scripts and meeting expectations without ever feeling genuinely connected to the people around me. "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching the Webb family from the outside," I admitted. "Like I'm playing a character in their story rather than actually being part of it. And now they want you to donate part of your liver to maintain that performance." When she put it that way, the entire situation took on a different cast. This wasn't about family love or natural obligations. This was about maintaining roles and meeting expectations that had never felt authentic to begin with. My phone buzzed with another text. This time from Dad's former commanding officer, General Harrison. "Patricia told me about your father's situation. Proud of you for stepping up to help a true American hero. The military family takes care of its own." The message infuriated me. Dad had obviously asked Patricia to reach out to his professional network, expanding the pressure campaign beyond immediate family. Now his military colleagues were weighing in on my personal medical decisions, framing liver donation as patriotic duty. I showed the text to Casey, who shook her head in disgust. "This is manipulation, Rebecca. They're using every emotional lever they can find to pressure you into major surgery." "But what if I'm just being selfish?" I asked. "What if I'm overthinking this because I'm scared of the surgery?" "Then you're scared of surgery, which is completely normal. But that doesn't make you selfish, and it doesn't obligate you to ignore your instincts." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Casey's question. Have you ever felt like you really belonged in your family? The answer was no, but I'd never examined why before. I'd assumed it was my fault, that I was too independent, too analytical, too resistant to emotional connection. But what if the problem wasn't me? What if there was a reason I'd never felt like I belonged? A reason beyond personality differences or generational gaps? I got up and made tea, then sat at my kitchen table with a notebook. I started writing down everything I could remember about feeling like an outsider in my own family. The list grew longer than I expected. Different interests from both parents. Different learning style. Different physical appearance. I was shorter, darker, with features that didn't obviously resemble either parent. Different blood type, discovered during a college health screening when both parents had type O and I had type A. The blood type discrepancy had puzzled the campus nurse. "Are you sure about your parents' blood types?" she'd asked. When I mentioned it to Mom later, She'd brushed it off. Blood types can be complicated, she'd said. Genetics aren't always straightforward. Now, sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., that conversation took on new significance. Blood types weren't complicated. They followed clear, predictable patterns. 2 type O parents couldn't produce a type A child. That was basic genetics, not complicated science. I opened my laptop and searched for information about paternity and blood type inheritance. Within minutes, I had my answer. It was genetically impossible for 2 type O parents to have a type A child, which meant either mom had lied about their blood types or one of them wasn't my biological parent. The realization hit like a physical blow. I sat staring at the screen, my tea growing cold in my hands. Either my mother or my father wasn't my biological parent, which would explain why I'd never felt like I belonged, why family connections had always felt performed rather than authentic, why the idea of donating my liver to save Dad's life felt more like obligation than love. My phone buzzed with yet another text, this one from Patricia. Spoke with Dr. Martinez about expediting your evaluation. She can see you Friday if you're willing to move quickly. Dad's numbers aren't improving. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. They wanted me to rush into donating part of my liver to a man who might not even be my biological father. They wanted me to undergo major surgery based on family obligations that might be built on lies. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt clarity instead of guilt. Before I made any decisions about liver donation, I needed to know the truth about my parentage. And I needed to understand why, if my suspicions were correct, they had hidden that truth from me for 24 years. I was done being manipulated by family obligations that might not even be real. It was time to find out who I actually was. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the National Archives in College Park. If there were secrets about my parentage, military records might hold clues. Patricia had worked as a civilian, contractor on various Army bases during the late 1990s, around the time I would have been conceived. Dad's service records would show his assignments during that period, and cross-referencing locations might reveal something useful. The research librarian, Mrs. Chen, had silver hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd helped countless people dig through decades of military bureaucracy. Personnel records from that era require specific authorization, she explained, but unit assignments and base locations are public information. I filled out request forms for Marcus Webb's service history, focusing on 1999 and 2000. While waiting for the files, I walked through the exhibits documenting military life during the 1990s. Photos of Army bases, deployment schedules, family housing, all the infrastructure that had shaped my childhood without me ever questioning its deeper implications. The files arrived in a manila folder thick with deployment orders, training assignments, and administrative correspondence. I spread everything across a reading table and began constructing a timeline. In March 1999, Dad had been assigned to Fort Bragg for a 6-month advanced training program. In August, he'd received orders for a temporary assignment to Fort Carson, Colorado, lasting through December. Fort Carson. I'd been born in Colorado Springs in March 2000, which meant I would have been conceived around June 1999. According to these records, Dad had been at Fort Bragg during that time frame, not in Colorado with Mom. I pulled out my phone and searched for Fort Bragg's location, North Carolina. Over 1,000 miles from Colorado Springs, where Mom had supposedly been living during her pregnancy. The timeline didn't match Dad's account of being present for my early development. My hands trembled slightly as I photographed the relevant documents. This wasn't just about blood types anymore. This was about geographic impossibility during the conception window. I drove home with questions multiplying in my mind. If Dad had been in North Carolina when I was conceived, and Mom had been in Colorado, how had they explained my existence? More importantly, who had been in Colorado with Mom during those crucial months? That afternoon, I called Patricia under the pretense of wanting to hear stories about my early childhood. "Oh, Rebecca, you were such an easy baby," she said, her voice taking on the nostalgic tone mothers use when reminiscing. "Even with your father deployed so much during your first year, you just adapted to whatever routine we had." "Deployed?" I asked casually. "I thought Dad was stationed stateside when I was born." A pause. "Well, yes, but you know how military assignments work. He was in and out for training programs, temporary duties. It felt like deployment to a new mother." Her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd prepared for this question. "Where exactly was he during my first few months?" "Oh, goodness, Rebecca. That was over 20 years ago. I can't remember every assignment." Her voice carried a slight edge now. "Why are you asking about ancient history?" "Just curious about family stories. You know how I like details." "Well, details from that long ago get fuzzy," she said dismissively. "What matters is that we were a family and we made it work despite the challenges." After hanging up, I sat in my living room staring at the military documents I'd spread across my coffee table. Patricia's evasiveness about Dad's whereabouts during my conception, combined with the blood type impossibility, painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. That evening, I called my grandmother Webb, hoping her memory might be sharper than Patricia's convenient forgetfulness. "Grandma, I'm working on a family history project," I lied smoothly. "Can you tell me about when I was born? I want to get the details right." Grandma Webb had always been proud of her encyclopedic memory for family milestones. "March 15, 2000, Colorado Springs Community Hospital, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Your mother was so nervous because Marcus couldn't get leave to be there." "He couldn't get leave?" "Some important training program he couldn't miss. Your mother was disappointed, but she understood military priorities. Patricia was always good about adapting to service life." My grandmother's matter-of-fact recounting contradicted everything I'd been told about my birth. Dad hadn't been there because he couldn't get leave, not because of some minor temporary assignment Patricia had characterized as insignificant. "Do you remember who was with Mom during the birth?" "That nice young officer who'd been helping her with base housing paperwork. What was his name?" "Something Spanish-sounding. Very thoughtful of him to drive her to the hospital when labor started." Spanish name. My heart rate increased. "Do you remember anything else about him?" "Not really, dear. Military people come and go so quickly. But your mother spoke highly of him. Said he was very supportive during that difficult time." After ending the call, I paced my apartment trying to process this new information. A helpful officer with a Spanish surname had been present for my birth, while my supposed father had been 1,000 miles away at a training program he couldn't leave. I opened my laptop and began researching Fort Carson's personnel assignments for 1999. The base's website had archived newsletters and announcements from that era. I searched through months of documents, looking for any mention of officers with Spanish surnames who might have been involved in family housing services. In the September 1999 newsletter, I found a brief article about a commendation ceremony. Major Rafael Santiago received recognition for exceptional service in family readiness group coordination and housing assistance programs. Major Santiago's dedication to military families has made him an invaluable resource during challenging transitions. Rafael Santiago. The name felt significant, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I searched for more information about him but found only routine military announcements, promotion notifications, training completions, assignment changes. My phone rang, interrupting my research. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," she said without preamble. "I realize I might have sounded dismissive about your interest in family history." "It's okay, Mom." "No, it's not okay. You deserve to know about your early years." Her voice carried an unusual vulnerability. "The truth is, that period was very stressful for me. Your father's training schedule, adjusting to motherhood, managing everything alone. Sometimes I prefer not to dwell on difficult memories. I understand. But I want you to know that despite the challenges, you were very much wanted and loved, even when circumstances were complicated. Circumstances were complicated. The phrase hung in the air like a confession wrapped in diplomatic language. What kind of complications? Oh, typical military family struggles. Separation, financial, stress, trying to maintain relationships across distances. Nothing unusual, just intense. I wanted to push further, but something in her tone warned me off. She was offering information, but also establishing boundaries about how deeply I could probe. Mom, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Do you think I should donate part of my liver to Dad? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Rebecca, of course you should help your father. Why would you even question that? Because major surgery isn't something to undertake lightly. And because I want to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. The right reason is love, Rebecca. Love for the man who raised you, who provided for you, who's always been your father regardless of whatever doubts you might be entertaining. Regardless of whatever doubts you might be entertaining, she knew. Somehow, she knew I was questioning paternity. And she was trying to head off that investigation by appealing to emotional rather than biological definitions of family. I'm not entertaining doubts, I said carefully. I'm just trying to understand my medical history before making decisions about donation. Your medical history is fine. You're healthy, you're compatible, and you're the only person who can save your father's life. That's all the history that matters right now. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment without turning on lights. Patricia's defensive responses had confirmed my suspicions rather than alleviating them. She was protecting a secret, and that secret was directly relevant to the liver donation decision they were pressuring me to make. I pulled out my phone and searched for DNA testing services. If biological relationships were being used to manipulate me into major surgery, I had the right to verify those relationships independently. Several companies offered expedited results for an additional fee. I ordered a paternity testing kit, with next-day delivery. Within 48 hours, I'd have scientific confirmation of what I increasingly suspected. Marcus Webb was not my biological father, but I also needed to know who was. If Rafael Santiago had been present for my birth, and supportive of Patricia during her pregnancy, there might be more to discover about their relationship. And if he was my biological father, I needed to understand why that truth had been hidden from me for 24 years. The pressure to donate my liver was intensifying daily, with family members calling to express their support for my decision to help Dad. But I was no longer willing to be pressured into irreversible medical procedures based on relationships that might not even be real. For the first time in my life, I was going to demand the truth about who I was and where I came from. And I was going to get that truth before anyone carved up my liver to save a man who might be nothing more than an elaborate lie. 3 days later, Patricia called with an invitation that felt more like a summons. The family is gathering for dinner Sunday at the house. Everyone wants to show support for your father during this difficult time. The house. She meant the Colonial in Arlington where I'd grown up, with its perfectly manicured lawn and collection of military commendations, displayed in the living room. Sunday dinners at the Webb house had always been formal affairs, Patricia's way of maintaining military family traditions even when Dad was deployed. Who's everyone? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Your aunts and uncles, some cousins, a few of your father's closest colleagues, people who care about this family and want to be here during the crisis. A few of Dad's closest colleagues. The dinner wasn't just family support, it was a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to maximize pressure on my liver donation decision. They were bringing in the heavy artillery. Literally. Mom, I haven't made any decisions yet about the transplant, which is exactly why we need to talk. as a family, with people who understand military sacrifice and family obligation. I wanted to refuse, but declining would only confirm their narrative that I was being selfish and unsupportive. Better to attend and observe how far they were willing to escalate their manipulation campaign. Sunday afternoon, I drove through the familiar neighborhoods of Arlington, past houses that all looked like variations of military housing, neat, modest, designed for functionality rather than personality. The Webb house sat on a corner lot, distinguished from its neighbors mainly by Dad's meticulous landscaping and the small American flag that flew year-round from the front porch. I parked behind Uncle Robert's pickup truck and Aunt Linda's sedan. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around the living room, setting up what looked like a formal presentation. My stomach clenched with anxiety. Patricia answered the door wearing her best dress and the smile she reserved for military social functions. "Rebecca, perfect timing. Everyone's here." The living room had been rearranged. Instead of the usual casual seating arrangement, chairs were positioned in rows facing the fireplace, where an easel held a poster board covered with medical charts and photographs. It looked like a briefing room, more than a family gathering. Uncle Robert stood near the easel, still wearing his dress uniform despite being retired for 5 years. Aunt Linda sat in the front row next to 2 men I didn't recognize, both in their 60s, both carrying themselves with military bearing. Cousins Jake and Maria occupied the back row, looking uncomfortable but present. "Rebecca!" Uncle Robert's voice boomed across the room. Come in. We've been waiting for you." I remained standing near the doorway, scanning the assembled group. "This looks very formal for a family dinner." "Well, we thought it would be helpful to present some information," Patricia said, guiding me toward an empty chair in the front row. "Help you understand exactly what we're dealing with." One of the strangers stood up and extended his hand. "Rebecca, I'm General Morrison, your father's former commanding officer, and this is Colonel Hayes from the Transplant Advisory Board at Walter Reed." Colonel Hayes nodded. "Your mother asked us to explain the medical realities from a military healthcare perspective. They had brought in a general and a medical officer to pressure me into donating my liver. The manipulation had escalated beyond family guilt trips into official military influence." "I appreciate everyone's concern," I said carefully. "But this is a personal medical decision that I need to make independently." Uncle Robert gestured toward the poster board. "Rebecca, let's look at the facts objectively. Your father has served this country for 30 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, Purple Heart recipient. He's saved more lives than we can count." The poster displayed Dad's military decorations alongside medical charts showing liver function decline. Photos from his deployment days were arranged next to hospital equipment, creating a visual narrative of heroic service leading to medical crisis. General Morrison stepped forward. "Young lady, your father is one of the finest officers I've ever served with. When good soldiers are in trouble, we don't abandon them. We adapt, we overcome, and we take care of our own." "With respect, sir, this isn't a military operation. It's a personal health decision." Colonel Hayes pulled out a tablet and began reading statistics. "Living liver donation has a 99.2% success rate for donors in your age group. Recovery time averages 6 to 8 weeks. Long-term complications are statistically negligible." "The medical risks aren't my primary concern," I replied. "Then what is?" Aunt Linda's voice carried a sharp edge. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're overthinking a simple family obligation." I looked around the room at the assembled faces, some concerned, some frustrated, all focused on me with an intensity that felt suffocating. These people had known me my entire life, had attended my graduations and birthday parties, had been part of every significant family event. Now they were united in pressuring me to undergo major surgery. "My concern," I said slowly, is that I'm being asked to make an irreversible medical decision based on family relationships that I'm not entirely sure I understand. The room went completely silent. Patricia's face flushed, and Uncle Robert's jaw tightened visibly. General Morrison leaned forward. "What exactly are you questioning, Rebecca?" "I'm questioning whether the family obligations being used to pressure me are based on accurate information about who I am and where I come from." Patricia stood up abruptly. "Rebecca, this is neither the time nor the place for whatever conspiracy theories you've been developing." "Conspiracy theories? I'm asking legitimate questions about my medical history and family background before agreeing to donate part of my liver." Colonel Hayes cleared his throat. "Ms. Webb, are you suggesting there are medical factors we haven't considered?" "I'm suggesting there might be genetic factors that haven't been accurately represented." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cousin Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maria stared at her hands. Uncle Robert looked between me and Patricia with growing alarm. "Rebecca." Patricia's voice carried a warning tone. "You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting your father's memory of service." "Dad's not dead yet, Mom, and I'm not disrespecting anyone by asking for honesty about my biological heritage." General Morrison stood up. "Young lady, I think you need to seriously consider what you're saying and who you're saying it to. I'm saying it to people who are trying to manipulate me into major surgery using family obligations that might not even be legitimate." Uncle Robert's face turned red. "Rebecca, that's enough. Your father is dying, and you're spinning fantasies to avoid helping him." "I'm not spinning fantasies. I'm asking questions that should have been answered years ago." Patricia moved toward the door. "I think this dinner was a mistake. Rebecca clearly isn't ready for rational discussion." "I'm ready for honest discussion," I replied, remaining seated. "I'm ready for someone to explain why my blood type is impossible given my supposed parents' genetics. I'm ready for someone to tell me who Rafael Santiago is and why he was present for my birth when my father was supposedly 1,000 miles away." The name hit the room like a bomb. Patricia went pale. Uncle Robert's mouth fell open. General Morrison and Colonel Hayes exchanged confused glances. "How do you know that name?" Patricia whispered. "Because I've been researching my family history, and Rafael Santiago keeps appearing in places where my biological father should be." I stood up and walked toward the door. "When you're ready to have an honest conversation about who I am and who my real father is, call me. Until then, stop trying to guilt me into donating organs based on lies." I left them sitting in their carefully arranged intervention, their military presentation materials still displayed on the easel. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversations beginning as the door closed. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt like I was the one in control of the situation. That night, I couldn't settle into any productive activity. My apartment felt too small, my thoughts too loud, my phone too quiet after the explosive dinner confrontation. I kept replaying Patricia's face when I mentioned Rafael Santiago, the way color had drained from her cheeks like someone had opened a valve. That wasn't surprise. That was recognition. That was fear. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything I knew for certain. The timeline inconsistencies, the blood type impossibility, Rafael Santiago's presence at my birth, Patricia's defensive responses whenever I asked direct questions, Dad's absence during my conception and birth, despite family mythology about his involvement. The DNA testing kit sat unopened on my counter, delivered that afternoon in a discreet brown package. I'd ordered it impulsively after the archive's research, but now it represented something more significant, the key to dismantling 24 years of carefully constructed fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Rebecca, we need to talk privately. Tomorrow after work, just the two of us." I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Only if you're ready to tell me the truth about Rafael Santiago." Her reply came immediately. Yes. One word that carried the weight of acknowledgement. She was finally ready to stop pretending, which meant my confrontation at dinner had accomplished something. But it also meant I was about to learn things that would fundamentally change how I understood my own identity. The next day dragged endlessly. I went through the motions at work, attending meetings, responding to emails, reviewing grant applications. But my mind was entirely focused on the evening's conversation. My colleagues noticed my distraction but attributed it to family stress, which wasn't entirely wrong. During lunch, I called Casey to update her on the previous night's events. You walked out after confronting them about Rafael Santiago? She sounded impressed. Rebecca, that's huge. You basically forced them into a corner. I think I forced my mother into finally telling me the truth. Are you ready for whatever that truth might be? I considered the question seriously. Was I ready to learn that the man I'd called father for 24 years had no biological connection to me? Was I ready to discover that my entire family structure had been built on deception? Was I ready to understand why I'd never felt like I belonged? I think I'm more ready for truth than I am for continuing to live a lie, I said finally. That evening, I arrived at Patricia's house. She'd moved to a smaller place in Fairfax after Dad's hospitalization made their Arlington home too difficult to maintain alone. The house felt sterile compared to our family home, lacking the accumulated history that comes from decades of shared life. Patricia had coffee waiting, along with a manila folder placed precisely in the center of her dining table. She looked older than I remembered, as if the previous night's confrontation had aged her several years and 24 hours. Sit down, she said quietly. I'm going to tell you everything, and I need you to listen to the whole story before you judge me. I sat across from her, my hands folded in my lap, trying to prepare for information that would reshape my understanding of everything. Rafael Santiago was your father's commanding officer at Fort Carson, Patricia began. Marcus was assigned there for advanced logistics training in 1999. I went with him, like I always did when possible. Her voice was steady but careful, like she was reciting something she'd rehearsed many times in her head. Rafael was different from the other officers. Older, more mature. He'd been through a difficult divorce and was raising his teenage son alone. He understood family challenges in ways that most career military men didn't. She paused to sip her coffee, gathering courage for what came next. Marcus was gone constantly during that assignment. Training exercises, field operations, temporary deployments. I was alone in a new place, didn't know anyone, and I was lonely. The word hung between us like a confession. Rafael was kind to me. He helped me navigate base housing, introduced me to other military spouses, included me in social events. When Marcus couldn't attend, it started as friendship. But it became more, I said. Patricia nodded, looking down at her hands. I told myself it was just emotional support during a difficult time. But Rafael made me feel valued in ways I hadn't experienced in years. He listened when I talked, remembered things that mattered to me, treated me like I was interesting rather than just useful. She opened the manila folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a younger Patricia laughing at something off camera, standing next to a man in military dress uniform. He had kind eyes and graying temples, and something about his features looked familiar when I studied them closely. This is Rafael? I asked. At the base Christmas party, 1999, 2 months before you were conceived. The timeline was becoming clear, but I needed her to say it explicitly. Rebecca, Rafael Santiago is your biological father. The words hit exactly as I'd expected them to, but hearing them spoken aloud still felt like stepping off a cliff. 24 years of identity dissolved in a single sentence. Does he know? I asked. No. When I realized I was pregnant, I was terrified. Marcus and I had been trying to have children for years without success. Suddenly I was pregnant, but by my husband. So you lied to Dad too? I convinced myself the timing might work. Marcus had been home briefly during the conception window. It was possible, even if unlikely. But you knew it wasn't possible. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. I knew, but I also knew that telling the truth would destroy our marriage, end Marcus's career, and leave me as a single mother with no support system. So you decided to build my entire life on a lie. I decided to protect our family the only way I knew how. I stared at the photograph of Rafael Santiago, trying to process that this stranger was my actual father. He looked like a good man, someone who would have been present for his daughter's birth, who would have been honest about family relationships, who wouldn't have demanded organ donations based on false obligations. Why are you telling me this? Now? I asked. Because you figured it out anyway. And because... She paused, struggling with something. Because you deserve to know who you are before you make any decisions about the liver donation. You mean before I undergo major surgery to save a man who isn't actually my father? Marcus raised you, Rebecca. He loved you as his daughter. Biology doesn't change that. Biology changes everything, I replied. It changes medical compatibility, family medical history, genetic risk factors. It changes whether I have any obligation to risk my life for his. Patricia looked stricken. You're still considering the donation? I'm considering a lot of things, including whether the man who's actually my biological father might want to know that his daughter exists. The possibility clearly hadn't occurred. To her. Rebecca, please think carefully about contacting Rafael. His life has moved on. He remarried, has other children now. Disrupting that could hurt a lot of people. More people than have already been hurt by 24 years of lies? I stood up and collected the photograph. I'm taking this, and I'm going to find Rafael Santiago. If you want to be part of that conversation, you need to decide how much more truth you're willing to tell. Patricia sat at her dining table, staring at the empty folder as I walked toward the door. Rebecca, she called after me. I turned back. I never meant for any of this to hurt you. But it did hurt me, I replied. Every day of my life, I felt like I didn't belong in this family. Now I know why. I left her house with a photograph of my real father and a determination to find answers that had been hidden from me since birth. The liver donation pressure campaign suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the larger questions about identity and truth that needed to be resolved. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of being pushed around by other people's agendas. Finding Rafael Santiago proved easier than I'd anticipated. Military records were surprisingly accessible when you knew the right databases to search. I spent the entire next day at the public library, using their computers to avoid leaving digital footprints on my personal devices. 3 hours of methodical, searching through Defense Department directories, retirement announcements, and veteran organization newsletters yielded a complete picture of his post-military life. Colonel Rafael Santiago, retired 2015 after 32 years of service. Currently residing in San Antonio, Texas, where he worked as a consultant for veteran transition services. Married to Maria Elena Santiago since 2003. 2 children from his second marriage, Elena, age 19, and Miguel, age 16. His LinkedIn profile showed a man who'd aged gracefully, silver-haired but still carrying himself with military bearing. I stared at his photo for a long time, searching for resemblances I'd never been able to find in Marcus Webb's features. The shape of my eyes, perhaps. The way his smile seemed to reach his eyes rather than stopping at his mouth. Small things that might be wishful thinking or might be real genetic echoes. His contact information was listed on the Veteran Services website, a professional email address and office phone number. I could reach out to him immediately if I chose to. But calling a stranger to inform him that he had a 24-year-old daughter felt like something that required careful planning. I drove home with my head spinning from information overload. Rafael Santiago wasn't just a name from Patricia's past. He was a real person with a current life, a family, responsibilities that didn't include me. Contacting him would detonate whatever stability he'd built over the past 2 decades. That evening, I called Casey to talk through my options. "So you found him," she said after I'd explained the day's research. "What's your next move?" "I have no idea. Do I call him? Send an email? Show up at his office? Every option feels like an invasion." "Rebecca, he's your biological father. You have a right to contact him." "But he doesn't know I exist. For all I know, he's completely forgotten about his relationship with Patricia." Casey was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something? What do you actually want from this?" The question stopped me cold. What did I want? Acknowledgement? A relationship? Medical history? Revenge against Patricia for lying? Understanding about why I'd never felt like I belonged? "I want to know who I am," I said finally. "I want to understand where I come from. And I want someone in my family to tell me the truth for once in my life." "Then you need to contact him." That night, I drafted and deleted a dozen emails. Every version sounded either too casual or too dramatic. How do you introduce yourself to your biological father without causing him a heart attack? Finally, I settled on something simple and direct. "Dear Colonel Santiago, my name is Rebecca Webb. I believe you knew my mother, Patricia Webb, when you were both stationed at Fort Carson in 1999. I have some questions about that time period that I hope you might be willing to discuss with me. Would you be available for a phone conversation this week? Thank you for your time. Rebecca." I sent it before I could overthink the wording further. His response came within 3 hours. "Rebecca, I remember your mother well. I'd be happy to speak with you. Can you call me tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Central Time? My direct number is below. Best regards, Rafael Santiago." The speed of his response surprised me. Most people would have asked more questions before agreeing to talk with a stranger about events from 20 years ago. Either he was naturally helpful, or he suspected this conversation might be about more than casual reminiscence. I barely slept that night, rehearsing potential conversations and trying to prepare for every possible reaction. What if he denied knowing Patricia well? What if he confirmed the relationship but refused to acknowledge paternity? What if he was angry about being contacted? What if he wanted nothing to do with me? The next day dragged endlessly. I left work early, claiming a doctor's appointment, and spent the afternoon pacing my apartment while watching the clock. At 6:45 p.m., I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, a glass of water, and Rafael Santiago's phone number written on a piece of paper. At exactly 7 p.m. Central Time, I dialed. He answered on the second ring. "Rafael Santiago." "Colonel Santiago, this is Rebecca Webb. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Please call me Rafael, and thank you for reaching out." His voice was warm, with a slight accent that hadn't come through in his email. "I've been curious about your call since receiving your message. I'm sure this seems unusual, contacting you out of nowhere about events from so long ago. Not as unusual as you might think. When you've served as long as I have, you learn that the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it." I took a deep breath. "Rafael, I need to ask you directly about your relationship with my mother in 1999. A pause. "Patricia and I became close friends during a difficult time in both our lives. She was alone frequently due to her husband's training schedule, and I was adjusting to divorce and single parenthood. We provided emotional support for each other. His careful language suggested he was choosing his words deliberately, the way people do when they're discussing sensitive topics that might have legal or personal implications. Was your relationship purely friendship?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Rebecca, may I ask why you're inquiring about this?" Because I have reason to believe that you might be my biological father. The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear background noise on his end. Television, family voices, the sounds of normal domestic life that I was about to potentially disrupt forever. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. What makes you believe that? Timeline inconsistencies around my conception. Blood type incompatibility with my supposed parents. And my mother recently confirmed that you two had a relationship during the relevant time period. Patricia confirmed this? She told me everything 2 days ago. About the affair, about the timing, about lying to Marcus about my parentage. Jesus, he whispered. Rebecca, I had no idea. Patricia never told me she was pregnant. I was transferred to Germany in early 2000, and we lost contact completely. So you didn't know about me. I didn't even know she'd had a child. The last time we spoke was December 1999, right before my transfer orders came through. I could hear genuine shock in his voice, which was somehow both relieving and heartbreaking. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd never known I existed. Raphael, would you be willing to take a DNA test to confirm paternity? Yes, he said immediately. Absolutely. Rebecca, if you're my daughter, then I've missed 24 years of your life. I need to know the truth as much as you do. For the first time since this entire crisis began, I felt like someone was on my side. Someone who wanted answers rather than demanding sacrifices. There's something else, I said. The reason this all came up is because Marcus Webb is dying of liver failure, and the family has been pressuring me to donate part of my liver to save him. The man who's been raising you as his daughter is asking you to undergo major surgery to save his life. Yes. And I've been feeling guilty about hesitating, but now I understand why I was reluctant. Some part of me knew the relationship wasn't real. Raphael was quiet for a moment. Rebecca, whether or not I'm your biological father, you should never feel obligated to undergo dangerous surgery because of family pressure. That decision has to be yours alone. That's the first time anyone in my family has said that. Then you need better family, he said gently. And if the DNA test confirms what we both suspect, you'll have one. The DNA testing kit I'd ordered for Marcus Webb sat unopened in my kitchen drawer, but I needed a different approach now. Raphael and I agreed to use a laboratory-grade paternity test that would provide legally admissible results. He arranged for sample collection at a medical facility in San Antonio, while I scheduled mine at a clinic in Arlington. Both samples would be processed at the same independent laboratory to ensure accuracy and avoid any potential tampering. While waiting for the DNA results, Raphael and I began talking daily. These weren't the awkward conversations I'd anticipated between strangers, discussing a potential biological connection. Instead, they felt like conversations I'd been waiting my entire life to have. Tell me about yourself, he said during our third call. What do you do for work? What are your interests? I want to know who you've become. I found myself describing my job at the nonprofit, my passion for helping underserved communities access educational resources, my tendency to research everything thoroughly before making decisions. He listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. You work with educational access programs? He asked. That's exactly what I do with veteran transition services, helping people who've been overlooked by traditional systems. The similarity struck me as significant. We'd both gravitated toward work that involved advocacy for people who didn't fit conventional molds. What about family medical history? I asked during our fourth conversation. If you are my biological father, there are things I should know. My side of the family has strong cardiovascular health and longevity, he said. My father lived to 93, my mother to 88. Some history of diabetes in later generations, but generally good genetic foundation. What about health? Issues you've experienced? I described my consistently excellent health, the way I'd always recovered quickly from illnesses that kept other people down for weeks. The doctors have always said I have an unusually strong constitution. That sounds like Santiago genetics, he said with what I could hear was a smile. We're a resilient family. We're a resilient family. The phrase echoed in my mind long after. We hung up. For the first time in my life, someone was claiming me as part of their genetic legacy with pride rather than obligation. Meanwhile, the pressure from the Webb family intensified. Patricia called daily with updates on Marcus's deteriorating condition. Uncle Robert left voicemails about time running out and family loyalty. Aunt Linda sent text messages with photos of Marcus in his hospital bed, looking frail and connected to increasingly complex medical equipment. The doctors say he has maybe 2 weeks without a transplant, Patricia said during one particularly manipulative call. Rebecca, I know you're going through some kind of identity crisis, but your father is dying while you're playing detective. Games. He's not my father, I said quietly. He raised you. He provided for you. He loved you as his daughter for 24 years. That makes him your father regardless of genetics. If that's true, then he should understand why I need to verify the genetic relationships before making medical decisions based on them. Patricia's frustration was audible. You're being selfish and cruel. Whatever issues you have with this family, Marcus doesn't deserve to suffer for them. After hanging up, I sat in my living room feeling the familiar weight of Webb family guilt. Despite everything I'd learned about lies and manipulation, part of me still responded to their emotional leverage. Marcus Webb had provided for me, had been present for school events and graduations, had taught me discipline and work ethic. Did those years of practical fatherhood create obligations that transcended biology? My phone rang again. Raphael's name appeared on the screen. Rebecca, I wanted to check on you. You sounded stressed during our call yesterday. The pressure about the liver donation is getting intense. Marcus is getting sicker, and everyone's acting like I'm murdering him by not immediately volunteering. My organs. That must be incredibly difficult. The worst part is feeling guilty about hesitating. Even knowing what I know now about paternity, I still feel like maybe I owe him something for the years he supported me. Raphael was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something about my experience with family obligation? Please. When I was your age, my father expected me to take over the family business instead of joining the military. He said I owed him that much after everything he'd sacrificed for our family. The guilt was crushing. I felt like I was betraying the man who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college. What did you do? I joined the army anyway. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was the right decision. My father was furious for years, but eventually he understood that I had to live my own life according to my own values. Did you regret it? Never. And you know what I learned? Real love doesn't demand sacrifice of your fundamental well-being. Real love wants you to make decisions that honor your own integrity. His words hit something deep in my chest. The Webby. Family's version of love had always involved surrender. Surrender of my comfort, my preferences, my autonomy, and now potentially my health. Rebecca, whether or not I'm your biological father, I want you to know something. Any decision you make about this liver donation will be the right decision if it's made freely, without coercion. You don't owe anyone your organs, regardless of family relationships. 2 days later, the DNA results arrived via secure email. I opened the attachment with hands that trembled slightly, even though I already knew what it would say. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The numbers on the screen confirmed what I'd suspected, but seeing it in official laboratory documentation felt like stepping into an entirely new identity. Rafael Santiago was my biological father. Marcus Webb was a man who'd raised another man's daughter for 24 years without knowing it. I called Rafael immediately. I got the results, I said when he answered. And? 97% probability. You're my father. The silence on the other end lasted longer than I expected. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. Rebecca, I've thought about this possibility every day since our first conversation, but seeing it confirmed. I have a daughter. I've had a daughter for 24 years and never knew it. Are you okay with that? I'm devastated that I missed your entire childhood. I'm angry at Patricia for keeping this secret, but I'm also grateful beyond words that you found me. You're my daughter, and I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. For the first time since this crisis began, I started crying. Not from stress or frustration, but from relief. Finally, someone wanted me in their life without conditions or expectations. Someone was claiming me as family because they actually were family. Raphael, there's something I need to tell you about the liver donation pressure. What is it? I've decided. I'm not doing it. Marcus Webb isn't my father, and I'm not risking my life to save someone who's spent 24 years unknowingly perpetuating a lie. I support that decision completely. Even if it means he might die? Rebecca, his medical crisis doesn't obligate you to undergo dangerous surgery. That's not how family works, and it's definitely not how love works. I hung up feeling like I'd finally found solid ground after months of shifting quicksand. The DNA test had given me more than just paternity confirmation. It had given me permission to trust my own instincts about what I owed to whom. Now I had to tell the Webb family that their manipulation campaign had failed and that their medical crisis would need to be solved without carving up my liver. But first, I wanted to spend some time getting to know my real father. Armed with DNA confirmation and a newfound relationship with my biological father, I decided to investigate exactly how deep the Webb family deception ran. If they'd lied about paternity for 24 years, what other secrets were buried in our family history? I started with financial records. During our daily conversations, Raphael had mentioned sending money to Patricia after learning about my existence through her pregnancy. I wanted to help with medical expenses and baby costs, he'd told me. But she returned every check uncashed, saying Marcus was handling everything. This detail nagged at me. If Patricia had refused financial support from my biological father, how had they explained sudden pregnancy expenses to Marcus? I requested copies of my parents' tax returns from 1999 and 2000, claiming I needed them for a graduate school financial aid application. The documents revealed something disturbing. In 1999, Marcus and Patricia had claimed a significant tax deduction for adoption-related expenses. Over $8,000 in legal fees, medical costs, and administrative charges, all categorized under family building expenses, that suggested they'd been planning to adopt a child. But they hadn't adopted a child. They'd had me. Or rather, Patricia had given birth to me and somehow convinced Marcus that I was his biological daughter, while simultaneously claiming adoption expenses on their taxes. I called Raphael with this discovery. Adoption expenses? He said, clearly confused. Rebecca, that doesn't make sense. Patricia was definitely pregnant when I knew her. I saw her at medical appointments, watched her condition progress. There was no adoption involved. Unless they were planning to adopt a different child and used my birth to cover up those expenses. Or unless Marcus knew you weren't his biological child and they structured the situation as a legal adoption to protect everyone involved. The possibility stopped me cold. What if Marcus had known about my parentage from the beginning? What if the entire family mythology about my birth had been carefully constructed theater designed to hide a more complex arrangement? I needed more information. That weekend, I drove to Patricia's house unannounced, carrying copies of the tax documents and a list of questions that demanded honest answers. She opened the door wearing a bathrobe and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been expecting bad news for weeks. Rebecca, if you're here to argue about the liver donation again, I don't have the energy. I'm here to ask about the adoption expenses you and Marcus claimed in 1999. Her face went completely white. What adoption expenses? I handed her the tax documents. $8,000 in legal fees and administrative costs for family building? Care to explain why you were claiming adoption expenses during the year I was conceived? She stared at the papers for a long time before sinking into her living room chair. How did you get these? I requested them. Patricia, did Marcus know I wasn't his biological daughter? She was quiet for so long I thought she might refuse to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. He suspected. My pregnancy happened too quickly after his return from training, and he'd had fertility testing done years earlier that suggested conception would be difficult. So he knew. He didn't know for certain, but he had doubts. When I told him about the pregnancy, he asked directly if the child was his. What did you tell him? I told him it was possible, but that I'd had a relationship with someone else during his absence. I told him the truth, Rebecca. I gave him the choice to walk away or raise you as his daughter regardless of genetics. This revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about the Webb family dynamics. Marcus hadn't been an unknowing victim of deception. He'd been a willing participant in a complex arrangement that served everyone's interests except mine. The adoption expenses were for legally establishing his parental rights, even if biological paternity was questionable, Patricia continued. His lawyer recommended documenting everything as an adoption to avoid future complications. So my entire life has been a legal fiction. Your entire life has been built by a man who chose to be your father, even when he wasn't certain you were. His biological child. That's not fiction, Rebecca. That's love. But it didn't feel like love. It felt like a business arrangement disguised as family bonds, complete with legal documentation and tax benefits. Marcus had made a calculated decision to claim me as his daughter, which meant his current demands for liver donation were based on contracts rather than natural family connections. Does he know about Rafael Santiago? I asked. Patricia's expression told me he did. Marcus connected the dots years ago when you started asking questions about family medical history. He's always known Rafael was likely your biological father, and he never said anything. What was he supposed to say? I've raised you for 20 years, but you're not actually mine. How does that conversation benefit anyone? I left Patricia's house with a completely different understanding of my family situation. This wasn't a story about accidental deception or hidden affairs. This was a story about adults making calculated decisions to protect their own interests, while keeping me ignorant of the truth that defined my entire identity. Marcus Webb had always known I probably wasn't his biological daughter, which meant his current guilt trips about family obligation were deliberate manipulation rather than heartfelt paternal appeals. I spent 2 days preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I organized copies of every document: the DNA test results, the tax records showing adoption expenses, Rafael's contact information, and a timeline of all the lies that had been told over 24 years. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation. This was going to be a presentation of facts that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I called the hospital and arranged to meet with Marcus during visiting hours when Patricia would also be present. I wanted both of them to hear the evidence simultaneously, to prevent them from coordinating their responses or creating new versions of the truth. Tuesday afternoon, I walked into room 314 carrying a manila folder that contained everything I'd discovered. Marcus looked worse than when I'd seen him 2 weeks earlier. The yellow tint to his skin had deepened, and he seemed to have lost weight despite the IV nutrition. Patricia sat in her usual chair, looking anxious about my unexpected request for a family meeting. Rebecca, Marcus said, his voice weaker than I remembered. Patricia said you wanted to discuss the transplant situation. Not exactly, I replied, pulling a chair closer to his bed. I want to discuss the truth about my parentage and why you've both been lying to me for 24 years. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Patricia's back stiffened, and Marcus's eyes focused on me with sudden alertness despite his medical condition. I opened the folder and placed the DNA test results on his bedside table. This confirms that Rafael Santiago is my biological father, not you. Marcus stared at the document without picking it up. Rebecca, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I'm not finished, I interrupted, placing the tax records beside the DNA results. These show that you and Patricia claimed $8,000 in adoption expenses during 1999, the year I was conceived. You legally adopted me because you knew I wasn't your biological child. Patricia started to speak, but I held up my hand. I've also spoken extensively with Rafael Santiago, who confirmed his relationship with Patricia and expressed shock at learning about my existence. He never knew she was pregnant, never knew I existed until I contacted him last week. Marcus was completely still, his eyes moving between the documents and my face. So here's what actually happened, I continued. Patricia had an affair with Rafael Santiago while you were away for training. She got pregnant. When she told you about the pregnancy, you suspected or knew the child wasn't yours, but you made a calculated decision to raise me anyway for reasons I'm still trying to understand. Rebecca, Patricia said quietly. You're oversimplifying a very complex situation. Am I? Because it seems pretty straightforward. You both decided to build my entire identity on a lie, complete with legal documentation and tax benefits. And now, 24 years later, you're using family obligation to pressure me into major surgery to save the life of a man who isn't actually my father. Marcus shifted in his bed, seeming to gather energy for a response. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite his physical weakness. You're right about the biology, he said. I've known since you were born that Rafael Santiago was likely your father. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Then why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't matter, he replied. I chose to be your father. I chose to raise you, provide for you, love you as my daughter. Biology is just genetics, Rebecca. Family is about choice and commitment. Family is about honesty, I shot back. Family is about giving people the information they need to make informed decisions about their own lives. What decisions? Patricia asked. What would knowing about Rafael have changed? It would have changed everything. My medical history, my sense of identity, my understanding of why I never felt like I belonged in this family. It would have given me the choice to know my biological father instead of spending 24 years feeling like an outsider in my own life. Marcus reached for the DNA test results and studied them carefully. What do you want from us now? An apology? Recognition that we made mistakes? I want you to stop using fake family obligations to manipulate me into donating my liver. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Patricia gasped audibly, and Marcus's face hardened. That's what this is really about, he said. You've constructed this entire investigation to justify refusing to help me. No, I replied firmly. I constructed this investigation because I deserve to know the truth about my own identity. The liver donation decision is separate, but it's certainly influenced by learning that the family obligations you've been using to pressure me are based on legal arrangements rather than biological relationships. So you won't help me because I'm not your biological father. I won't help you because you've spent 24 years lying to me about who I am, and now you're trying to use emotional manipulation to pressure me into major surgery. This isn't about biology, Marcus. This is about honesty and respect. Patricia stood up abruptly. Rebecca, your father is dying. Whatever anger you have about the past, he doesn't deserve to suffer for decisions we made when you were a baby. You're right, I said. He doesn't deserve to suffer. But I also don't deserve to be guilted into dangerous surgery by people who have never been honest with me about the most basic facts of my existence. I gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder. I've made my decision about the liver donation. The answer is no. Not because of biology, but because I refuse to be manipulated by people who have lied to me my entire life. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. So that's it? You're going to let me die to make a point about honesty? I'm going to preserve my own health and integrity rather than sacrifice them for people who have never respected either. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. For what it's worth, I'm grateful you chose to raise me, but that choice doesn't give you the right to demand my organs 24 years later. The backlash started within hours of my hospital confrontation. Patricia must have called every relative immediately after I left because my phone began buzzing with angry messages before I'd even reached my car. Uncle Robert's voicemail was the first. "Rebecca, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this selfishness has gone too far. Your father is dying, and you're playing games with DNA tests and ancient history. Family means sacrifice, and right now you're failing at being family." Aunt Linda's text came next. "Heard about your decision. Disgusted doesn't begin to cover it. Marcus raised you, loved you, provided for you for 24 years, and this is how you repay him? By letting him die over some technicality about biology? The Messages multiplied throughout the evening. Cousin Jake called me heartless and vindictive. Cousin Maria accused me of abandoning family when they need you most. Even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years felt compelled to weigh in on my medical decisions. But the worst message came from General Morrison, who somehow had gotten my personal cell phone number. "Ms. Webb, I'm profoundly disappointed in your decision to abandon a decorated veteran in his time of greatest need. Your father served this country with honor for 30 years. The least his daughter could do is show the same courage he demonstrated on foreign battlefields." The military. Guilt trip felt particularly manipulative. They were framing my refusal to donate organs as cowardice, as if refusing dangerous surgery was equivalent to deserting under fire. I called Casey to vent my frustration. "They're acting like I'm committing murder by not volunteering my liver. Rebecca, you realize this reaction proves you made the right decision, right? Healthy families don't respond to personal medical choices with character assassination campaigns. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm being selfish and he really does deserve my help because of all the years he supported me? Stop. You're not wrong. You're setting boundaries with people who have manipulated you your entire life." The pressure campaign escalated over the next few days. Patricia called repeatedly, alternating between tearful pleas and angry accusations. "Rebecca, I know you're hurt about the secrets, but this isn't the time for vindictive behavior. Your father has maybe a week left without a transplant." "He's not my father," I replied during one of these calls. "He's been your father for 24 years. That has to count for something." "It counts for something, but not for major surgery based on lies and manipulation." The family rumors reached new levels of cruelty. According to Casey, who heard it through mutual friends, the Webb family was telling people I'd always been unstable and had finally snapped under pressure. They were suggesting I needed psychiatric evaluation and that my refusal to donate was evidence of mental illness rather than rational decision-making. Uncle Robert sent me a formal letter that read like a legal document. "Rebecca, your actions regarding your father's medical crisis have brought shame upon the Webb family name. Your selfish behavior during Marcus's time of need demonstrates a fundamental lack of character that calls into question everything he tried to teach you about duty and honor." The character attack stung more than I expected. These people had known me my entire life, had attended my birthday parties and graduations, had claimed to love me as family. Now they were systematically destroying my reputation because I wouldn't submit to their demands for my organs. But the most devastating blow came from Marcus himself. He recorded a video message that Patricia shared with the entire extended family. In it, he looked directly into the camera, weak but determined, and spoke in the measured tone of a military officer giving final orders. "I want everyone to know that my daughter Rebecca has chosen to let me die rather than help save my life. Despite 24 years of love, support, and sacrifice, she has decided that biological technicalities matter more than family loyalty. I don't understand this decision, but I respect her right to make it. I just want people to remember that when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. The video devastated me. Not because I believed his characterization of my decision, but because it showed how far he was willing to go to punish me for refusing his demands. He was using his dying moments to destroy my relationships with everyone who'd ever cared about me. Raphael called that evening after I'd forwarded him the video. "Rebecca, that man is emotionally abusing you from his deathbed. This isn't about family love. This is about control and manipulation. But what if he's right? What if I am being selfish? Selfish would be demanding someone else's organs to save your life. Selfish would be lying to a child for 24 years about their parentage. Selfish would be recording manipulative videos to punish someone for making independent medical decisions." His perspective helped, but it didn't eliminate the crushing weight of family rejection. Every relationship I'd built over 24 years was being destroyed because I wouldn't sacrifice my liver to maintain their lies. "Raphael, I feel like I'm losing everyone I've ever known." "Maybe," he said gently. "But you're gaining something more important. You're gaining yourself. And you're gaining a father who will never ask you to sacrifice your well-being to prove your love." The Webb family's scorched earth response to my refusal showed me exactly who they were when they couldn't control me. It hurt, but it also confirmed that walking away from their manipulation was the healthiest decision I'd ever made. 6 months later, I stood in the arrivals terminal at San Antonio International Airport, holding a sign that read, "Santiago Family." Raphael had invited me to spend Thanksgiving with his wife Maria Elena and their children, my half-siblings I was meeting for the first time. Marcus Webb had died 3 weeks after our confrontation. Patricia found a compatible donor through the transplant waiting list, but complications during surgery proved fatal. I felt sadness at his passing, but not guilt. I'd made peace with my decision. The funeral was closed to me. Patricia made it clear I wasn't welcome, telling relatives I'd abandoned the family when they needed me most. But Uncle Robert surprised everyone by reaching out privately to express his regret about the family's treatment of me. "We handled this badly," he admitted during a quiet phone call. "Fear makes people ugly, and we were all terrified of losing Marcus." Elena Santiago, 19 and studying pre-med, emerged from the gate with her younger brother Miguel. They'd agreed to meet their surprise older sister with remarkable grace, asking thoughtful questions about my life and sharing stories about their father. "Dad talks about you constantly," Elena said as we walked to baggage claim. "He's so proud of how you handled everything with dignity." At dinner that evening, surrounded by people who shared my genetics and my values, I finally understood what family was supposed to feel like. No manipulation, no conditions, no demands for sacrifice to prove belonging. Maria Elena raised her glass for a toast. To Rebecca, who found the courage to choose truth over convenience and family over fear. Raphael squeezed my hand. To my daughter, who taught me that love means respecting someone's right to make their own choices. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at home. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales about finding your true identity and standing up for your values. Your support helps us share stories that matter and reminds people that choosing truth over manipulation is always worth the cost.